the idea that because Trump has come along, he's given up on those goals is ludicrous. It's just absolutely farcical, and just displays Trump's complete misunderstanding of both Putin and this war. He really just does not get it, unfortunately.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've had Jimmy Rushton on the show. He's a Kyiv-based journalist and foreign policy and security expert who's spoken to us about this three-day ceasefire that Vladimir Putin has invoked for early May to commemorate the end of Second World War anniversary, and whether this was just a tactic to stall Donald Trump even further to make him believe that he actually does want peace. So we speak to him all about that, and as well as the state of the situation in Ukraine. He speaks to us about the misconceptions between the Russian and the Ukrainian troops. He basically said, look, Russia is not gaining as much ground as perhaps some media outlets, or of course a Russian spokespeople would say, that Ukraine is doing well, but if they had a little bit more backing, they'd be able to win this war. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on Times Radio's YouTube. Jimmy Rushton, Kyiv-based journalist and policy and security analyst, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you.
It's good to have you back on the show. So much has happened since you and I last spoke. So much has happened, and yet nothing has really been resolved when it comes to brokering this peace deal, this end of war between Russia and Ukraine. But what we've seen in the last few days is Vladimir Putin announcing that he and the Kremlin have decided to invoke a three-day ceasefire with Ukraine over May 7th to 11th for humanitarian reasons and to commemorate the end of World War II, the anniversary. The White House responded to this, Jimmy, kind of insinuating that it wasn't enough, that there needs to be a permanent ceasefire, that these 3 days just wasn't what they wanted. They wanted it to invoke on a proper tools down, weapons down. But do you think those calls will fall on deaf ears?
In Russia, they will, for sure. I think this is a rare case where Ukraine and the US are actually singing from the same hymn sheet, really. Both the Americans and the Ukrainians have said, well, firstly, why are you waiting until the Victory Day commemorations to have this ceasefire? And secondly, why is it only for 3 days, 72 hours? It's for the Ukrainians, it only really makes sense if it's the first step towards a sustainable ceasefire. Giving the Russians another break to, rotate troops, prepare for fresh assaults really doesn't do anything for the Ukrainians at all, particularly when the last ceasefire was largely disregarded, at least on the ground. They did respect it in the air, but on the ground, assaults continued, shelling continued, drone strikes continued.
Well, I want to get into that, Jimmy, because, of course, over Easter there was meant to be a ceasefire between the two countries, but Vladimir Zelensky did say that Vladimir Putin had disrespected the truce, the ceasefire. He said that a few times when there have been a few of those ceasefires. We saw that first one on energy and infrastructure facilities in both countries, accusing Putin of not respecting it. So when you're obviously based in Kyiv and you're in the know of what's happening on the ground in Ukraine and from a military perspective. So over that Easter weekend, did Putin and the Kremlin launch various strikes and go against that ceasefire?
So there weren't any air raids, there weren't any large drone strikes or missile strikes on Ukrainian targets, at least as far as I'm aware. I did speak to multiple different contacts in the Ukrainian military who are fighting in different directions on the front line, and they all told me that essentially fighting continued, if not as normal. There was significant fighting. There were Russian assaults, there were Russian drone strikes using small tactical drones, FPV drones. There was artillery. The Russians also tried to rotate troops, so they used because there was a slight lull in the fighting, they used the lull in the fighting to bring fresh troops up to fighting positions. The Ukrainian troops have been told to not engage the Russians unless they were engaged first during this time, and the Russians did exploit it. It definitely wasn't, a ceasefire that they observed in good faith at all.
Do you see, so we saw Donald Trump the other day, late last week, saying that he now believes that Putin is tapping him along, a revelation that has taken some time, Jimmy, but A lot of people, experts, believe that Vladimir Putin announcing this 3-day ceasefire in May is just another stalling tactic. He's basically responded to Trump lashing out at him and said, okay, well, I'm going to throw another ceasefire in the mix and see if this stalls the president again.
Yeah, absolutely. That's completely correct in my opinion. Also, I think there's an element of the Russians don't want Ukrainian drone strikes because the Ukrainian drone program is incredibly capable. They don't want drone strikes on Moscow disrupting their party, especially not when they have numerous high-profile dignitaries arriving for this commemoration. So I think there's an element of that as well. I mean, you can just look at, say, Lavrov's statement a couple of days ago where he reiterated Moscow's maximalist demands for engaging in any form of ceasefire, which is the four provinces that Russia claimed to have annexed in September 2022, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Luhansk, Donetsk. They don't control the majority or the entirety of all of these provinces. They don't control the regional capitals of Kherson and Zaporizhia, and essentially their preconditions for entering peace talks is that Ukraine and the international community have to recognize Russian sovereignty over the entirety of these provinces. For Ukraine, that would mean moving, 1 million people out of these areas, or essentially abandoning them to Russian occupation. So no Ukrainian government is ever going to agree to that. They're also talking about the demilitarization and the denazification of Ukraine, which is essentially code for Ukraine's complete surrender, the removal of the Zelensky government, which is obviously elected by the Ukrainian people, and the disarmament and disbanding of the Ukrainian army, at which point, there's nothing to stop Russia from taking the entirety of Ukraine, which is clearly what they plan to do in the long term.
Jimmy, I want to get into that full ceasefire proposal from the US, but to start with, I want your thoughts on this comment from Donald Trump. On your comments just before, Trump said on the ABC in an interview, he said that he still thinks that Putin wants peace, despite these comments he made about Putin tapping him along. But he said, if it weren't for me, I think he'd want to take over the whole country. I will tell you, I am not happy when I see Putin shooting missiles into a few towns and cities. So this saying, if it weren't for me, if it weren't for Trump, he would want to take the whole country, the whole of Ukraine. Isn't that the point of the war, that he does want the whole country? What do you think he wanted? Just what, the eastern areas?
Of course, no. It's completely delusional. Again, he's exaggerating the relationship that he believes he has with Putin, which just does not exist. Putin wants Ukraine. He wants the entirety of Ukraine, or at least he wants Ukraine to be a puppet state, something less than Belarus is today. He wants Ukraine to not exist as an independent state. He wants the democratic will of the Ukrainian people to be abrogated. And, the idea that because Trump has come along, he's given up on those goals is ludicrous. It's just absolutely farcical. It just displays Trump's complete misunderstanding of both Putin and this war. He really just does not get it, unfortunately.
The US tabled a kind of ceasefire proposal to Putin and to Kyiv, and it would basically officially see Crimea recognized as Russian territory. So we saw obviously Crimea annexed by Russia in 2014, and then Russia has currently taken about 20% of Ukraine, mostly that eastern area. Ukraine rejected this proposal for obvious reasons, but Russia's diplomats said that they basically won't enter any sort of peace deal until it's internationally recognized, as well as that 20% of the Russian occupied territory as Russian. What is your response when you see a comment like that, that not only is the US willing, because Donald Trump has basically said that Crimea has been in the hands of Russia since 2014, so therefore it is Russian territory and he will recognize that. But the fact that Russia's top diplomat is also saying that not only that, he wants the world to recognize Crimea and those 20% of occupied land as officially Russian territory in order to enter a peace deal. What's your response to that?
I mean, it displays the kind of ridiculous misunderstanding of global opinion, because the Europeans are never going to accept this, partly because this would upend essentially the entire post-war security order, or at least the understanding that borders cannot be changed through the force of arms. And we've already seen that degrade quite dramatically recently. I think for the Europeans, whatever the Americans say, and I think this is a case of America really, they are the most powerful country in the world, but they overestimate their influence here, I think, and their power here. They cannot force the Ukrainians into accepting this deal. And they also can't force the Europeans into lifting sanctions or recognizing Crimea as Russian territory, which the Europeans are not going to do. It goes over and above what you said. It's not just the occupied territories that Russia wants the international community, the world to recognize. It's also, again, the territory that they don't even occupy that are a part of these 4 provinces of Ukraine. So, it's over and above just even kind of holding what they currently occupy. The Ukrainians might be willing to accept de facto Russian control over Crimea and parts of these occupied territories, but they're never going to accept de jure Russian control of these territories, essentially accepting that these are, by law, Russian territories. They're never going to accept that. And again, neither will the Europeans, neither will the majority of the international community, including, I would say, China, because the Chinese are, they never have recognized Crimea as being Russian, despite obviously being one of Russia's allies, or at least one of their major supporters. And there are other countries as well, for example, Serbia, they also don't want to recognize Crimea as Russian because they have issues with Kosovo. There's a lot of countries that don't want to, accept a precedent that internationally recognized borders can just be carved up by, the use of force, and, that we would live in a might makes right world, essentially. That's not good for a lot of countries, even powerful ones like China.
Well, I wonder, Jimmy, how Trump and his administration would be viewed on the world stage, and kind of in a legacy aspect, if, we did go a few years down the track and perhaps Ukraine gets pretty sick of the war. We know that they're fighting along and they're very prosperous. So this is probably a hypothetical situation that won't happen. But in a few years' time, Donald Trump's, he's out of office. Vladimir Putin basically decides, okay, I'm going to reignite the war. Donald Trump's out. I already occupy this much of Ukraine. I occupy this 20% as well as Crimea. I'm just going to reignite the war because now I've had a bit of time to collect some money. I've have a bit of time to have a bit more money from oil and from all the things I've been sanctioned from. And I now have easy access to different parts of Ukraine because I'm already within Ukraine, and Ukraine does not have security protection because the US has failed to sign off on it. So I don't know how Donald Trump doesn't see that, and I wonder if he knew how he would be viewed as a leader by signing off on that. If that makes sense, like how it would affect his legacy.
I think he just has such a delusional self-image, and he has such a delusional view of how he's viewed, that I don't think anything really can break through that. He's never been someone that has seemed to have had a moment of self-reflection in his entire life. And again, this is what you say is absolutely true, and this is Ukraine's great fear. This is the great fear in Europe, that if there is some form of pause without concrete security guarantees for Ukraine, then the war will just start up again in a couple of years' time, when Russia's had a chance to rearm, recruit more soldiers, and they will, they'll go again. They'll take the rest of Ukraine. How you deal with that? I mean, there's obviously, we've seen proposals. We've seen for this coalition of the willing, proposals for deployment of British, French, and others in Ukraine. But it's a difficult question. I don't think there are any easy answers, unfortunately. Very difficult question.
Yeah, and that is kind of my understanding, is that question has been one of the reasons why this has obviously been going in such roundabouts, because Ukraine are not going to sign off. Vladimir Zelensky is not going to sign off and giving up his land, because he knows what it means. He knows that it just means that they're giving power, and why should we be benefiting Putin? Why are we not condemning him? And Putin and Russia are not going to sign off on their end of the deal because they want something that Ukraine's not going to give. So it's just a kind of a roundabout situation, and it just goes to show how, I guess, delusional and how blindly optimistic Donald Trump was when he made that comment that he would end the war in 24 hours. But just a final question, Jimmy, because I can't keep you too long, but you've been on the ground spending a lot of time with Ukrainian troops in Kyiv, and what's your general understanding of misunderstandings when it comes to how the world, or how the media, but especially Americans, are viewing the state of the war, the state of Ukrainian troops versus Russian troops?
Sure. So essentially, when you hear the Americans talking about this, it's almost like the Russian army is on the verge of victory, on the verge of sweeping the Ukrainians back to Kyiv, breaking through their lines, causing a rout, something similar to that. But that's just not the case. The Russian army, where it is advancing incredibly slowly. They're taking incredible losses when they do advance. And if you look at the rate of advance, it would take them something like 80 to 90 years to occupy the entirety of Ukraine. So, Ukraine is not on the verge of winning, but they're definitely not on the verge of losing. And it is really, at the moment, a stalemate. For the Ukrainians, really, the goal is simple. It's to outlast the Russians. It's to keep fighting, to keep resisting. Because fundamentally, Ukraine will mean more to the Ukrainians than it will to the Russians. And we've seen similar patterns in, say, Afghanistan. We saw it in Vietnam. We've seen it in other conflicts around the world. The defending army generally has to outlast the larger invading army. And it's important for us in the West to do everything that we can do to, support the Ukrainians. And there are positive signs on that. The Ukrainian military is very, very heavily dependent on drones, and the British, there was a recent support package where we sent 150 million, something like that, in funding for hundreds of thousands of small drones, which cause the majority of casualties now. I think the misconception that the Russians are far more powerful than they actually are, and that the Ukrainians are far weaker than they actually are, is definitely damaging, because if you're essentially, the Trump administration is approaching these negotiations with the view that Ukraine has to sign any peace deal because they're on the verge of defeat, or they're on the verge of some form of rout, and that's just not the case at all. Not the case.
Jimmy, just a final, just a yes or no question. You think that if US, if Western allies actually gave as much aid, as much military support as they could to Ukraine, they would win the war easily on their own right?
Not easily, but they would win, yes.
Okay. Jimmy Rushton, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.